Welcome, friends, to Family Revenge Secrets, a place where the wounds of betrayal are exposed and the long road to healing begins. If you've ever felt invisible to the ones you raised, or if a family bond has become a broken trust, you've come to the right place. Be sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss a single story of resilience. This is a story about a woman named Evelyn, a quiet woman of 60, with hands that told a history. They were not the hands of a painter or a musician, but of a mother, rough from years of scrubbing laundry, soft from years of holding a sleeping child. They were hands that knew how to give, and in that knowing, they were happy. Evelyn was, by all accounts, a woman living a golden age. Her husband, Robert, had passed 10 years prior, leaving behind a silence that had taken a long time to fill. But time, as it always does, had woven new threads into the tapestry of her life. Her small house on Elm Street was a testament to a life well lived. The porch swing hummed with the ghosts of afternoon chats, the garden bloomed with the patience of a woman who understood seasons, and the photos on the mantelpiece, a gallery of smiles, of graduations, of birthdays, told a story of love. Her greatest masterpiece, however, was her son, David. At 35, David was everything a mother could wish for. He was handsome, with his father's eyes and a kindness that seemed to be all his own. He was successful in his career as a marketing manager, a detail Evelyn never tired of sharing with her friends. She'd watch him on the phone, his voice a steady hum of confidence, and her heart would swell with pride. "He's all grown up," she'd tell herself, a bittersweet joy that only a mother could comprehend. Her life's rhythm was a gentle one. Mornings started with coffee and a crossword puzzle, a quiet ritual she shared with the rising sun. Afternoons were for tending to her roses, their petals as delicate and hopeful as the plans she held for her future. Evenings were for knitting, for listening to old jazz records, and for the weekly phone call from David. These calls were her lifeline, a reminder of the unbreakable bond between them. "How are you doing, Mom?" he'd ask, his voice a familiar comfort. "Oh, I'm just fine, honey. Quiet as a church mouse," she'd reply with a soft chuckle. And it was true. Her world was small, but it was full. It was a world built on the foundation of a lifetime of honest work and careful savings. Every dollar earned, every penny saved was not just money. It was a promise to Robert, to herself, and to their future. The account was her sanctuary, the number on the statement a silent, reassuring hymn. It represented a future free of worry, a life of simple pleasures, and the security of a legacy. It was the quiet sum of a woman's devotion, both to her past and her future. The money was a tangible thing, a comfort she could count on. She thought of it as her reward, a well-deserved reward for a life of hard work, for raising a good man, for being a good person. It was a symbol of her independence, her last piece of freedom. And in the quiet hum of her home, that freedom felt infinite. She never saw the shadow that was slowly creeping toward that light. She never considered the possibility that the very future she had built, penny by penny, could be seen by someone else not as a legacy, but as a resource. The thought of betrayal, especially from her own flesh and blood, was as alien to her as the idea of a tree walking. To Evelyn, her son David was the very definition of love and loyalty. He was her rock, her future. He was everything. He was a good son. He always remembered her birthday. He never missed a Christmas. He called her regularly. He said he loved her. What more could a mother ask for? In the quiet of her solitude, she never once felt alone, because she knew she had him. She had her son. She had her savings. She had her life. And she was living it. Happy, unaware. This is the beginning of Evelyn's story. A story that began not with a bang, but with a whisper. A story that started with the simple, beautiful, and utterly fragile illusion of a perfect life. A life that was about to be turned upside down by a single phone call and a son she thought she knew. The phone rang just as Evelyn was putting the finishing touches on her garden's rose bushes, the scent of fresh earth and sweet petals in the air. It was David. She answered with a smile already on her face, but his voice on the other end was different. It lacked its usual easy confidence. It was strained, a little too tight. "Hey, Mom, got a minute?" he asked. "For you, honey, I've got a lifetime," she said, her smile not faltering, but her heart began to flutter with a quiet unease. This wasn't the usual weekly check-in call. This was something else. He started by rambling about a new business venture, a chance to get in on the ground floor of a tech startup that would, he promised, be the next big thing. He spoke of innovation, market share, and potential profits in a language she didn't quite understand but trusted because it was coming from him. Then, the tone shifted. He confessed that the project was a few $100,000 short on its funding goal. He'd exhausted his own savings and every other option. He was on the verge of losing everything he'd worked for. His voice cracked with a vulnerability she hadn't heard since he was a boy, pleading with her after a bad grade. "Mom, you're my only hope," he said, and the words hit her like a physical blow. "I'm sorry, honey," she said, her voice soft with sympathy. "I wish I could help, but all I have is my retirement savings. It's for my future." "Mom, this is our future," he countered, his tone urgent. He painted a picture of their lives transformed. He'd pay her back with a percentage of the profits, enough for her to live like a queen. She'd never have to worry about a single bill again. He spoke of taking her on a cruise, buying her a new car, and finally taking care of her the way she'd always taken care of him. The fantasy was beautiful, woven with promises of gratitude and endless prosperity. He talked about how this was the culmination of his life's work, a testament to his ambition, a chance to finally repay her for everything she had sacrificed. He reminded her of the countless times she'd put his needs before her own, of the night she'd sold her engagement ring to pay for his college tuition, a sacrifice she had never mentioned to him. He used her own memories as weapons, wrapping them in a cloak of love and duty. Evelyn was torn. The money wasn't just money, it was her late husband Robert's legacy. It was the result of their shared dream for a peaceful retirement. The thought of taking it all out for an investment she didn't fully understand terrified her. But the thought of her son, her only child, failing, losing everything he had worked so hard for, was a fear she couldn't bear. Her heart, that wellspring of unconditional love, overruled her mind's caution. David was her son. He would never betray her. He had always been so good, so grateful. This was just a hurdle, a final test of his resolve. She pictured his earnest face, the face of the little boy who used to run to her for comfort, and her decision was made. "All right, David," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I'll do it. I'll get the money for you." A breath of pure, relieved joy came through the phone. "Oh, Mom, thank you. You won't regret this. I promise. I love you so much." His gratitude was so genuine, so overwhelming that it washed away all her fear and doubt. She felt a surge of pride, a quiet elation. This was more than just a financial transaction. This was a testament to the bond between them. It was a leap of faith, an act of pure maternal love. She hung up the phone feeling lighter, like she had just performed her most important duty as a mother. She didn't need to see the spreadsheets or the business plans. She didn't need a lawyer to review the contract. All she needed was David's voice, full of hope and a desperate kind of love. She thought about her husband, Robert, and for a moment she felt his spirit next to her. She imagined him nodding, a smile on his face, understanding that their savings were being used for the most important purpose of all, to help their son. The next day, she walked into the bank, her purse clutched tightly in her hand. The bank manager, Mr. Henderson, looked at her with surprise when she told him she wanted to withdraw the entire amount from her retirement account. He asked if she was sure, if she had considered the risks. She simply smiled and shook her head, her mind filled with the wonderful promises David had made. It was a transaction of trust, not of money. She had all the security she needed in her heart. She would learn, in the cruelest of ways, that some currencies, no matter how much you invest, can never be exchanged for love. The transfer was made. A single, decisive keystroke in the bank manager's office, and with it, Evelyn's life savings vanished from her account. It wasn't gone, it was simply moved to David's account, to a future she believed in more than her own. She left the bank with a feeling of profound relief, a burden lifted. The hard part was over. Now came the reward. For the first few weeks, the reward seemed to be arriving in daily doses. David called her every evening, and his voice was filled with a familiar energy she had missed. He talked about the new business, about meetings, about the people he was collaborating with. He painted a vibrant picture of a future bustling with success and told her how smart she had been to trust him. She felt like she was a partner in his great adventure, an unseen co-founder. But then the calls began to slow. First, it was a skipped night. "I'm swamped, Mom," he'd text. "I'll call you tomorrow." She didn't mind, she understood. Success required hard work, long hours. A mother's patience was infinite. Then a whole week went by with nothing but a brief, hurried text. "Still swamped. Will call soon. Love you." The exclamation mark seemed to be doing all the heavy lifting. Evelyn started to worry. She'd check her phone constantly, its silent screen a small, cold window to her anxiety. She'd leave him voicemails, trying to keep her voice light and cheerful. "Just checking in, honey. Hope everything's going well. Call me when you get a chance." The chance never seemed to come. She began to notice other things, little cracks in the facade she had so carefully built. She called his best friend Mark to ask if he'd heard from David. Mark's reply was guarded. "He's busy, Mrs. Richter. He's got a lot going on." The use of her formal name instead of the friendly Evelyn was like a small slap. It told her more than his words did. The silence grew louder with each passing day. It was a silence that wasn't empty. It was filled with her own desperate questions. Was he okay? Was the business a failure? Had something terrible happened? The possibilities twisted and tangled in her mind, a knot of fear and doubt. She wanted to believe the best, but her instincts were screaming at her. Something was terribly, horribly wrong. One Tuesday evening, after a week and a half of no contact, she sat by the phone, her heart a drum against her ribs. She was about to give up when her phone finally lit up. It was him. A wave of relief, so powerful it made her weak, washed over her. "David, oh honey, I was so worried. Are you okay?" She blurted out. There was a long pause on the other end. Then a low sigh. "Mom, I'm fine. Look, I'm really busy right now. I just can't talk." The casual dismissal, the lack of apology, was like a physical coldness spreading through her. "But David, I just haven't heard from you. I wanted to know how everything was going. How's the business?" She pressed, her voice pleading. Another sigh, heavier this time. "It's fine, Mom, just fine. I gotta go. I'm late for dinner." "Wait, dinner with whom? Where are you?" she asked, a frantic edge to her tone. "It's just a business dinner. I'll call you later, bye." The line went dead. The familiar click in her ear was a sound she would come to know intimately. It was the sound of a door being slammed shut. She sat there, the phone still to her ear, the silence now a deafening roar. It was a silence filled not with a son's love, but with her own mounting terror. The golden future he had promised had begun to tarnish, and the darkness of doubt was closing in. The call ended with the cold finality of a slammed door, and Evelyn stood in her living room, her mind a whirlwind. She tried to make sense of his brevity, to find a reasonable explanation for the shift in his behavior. Maybe he was just under immense pressure. Maybe the business deal was in jeopardy, and he didn't want to worry her. She clung to these possibilities like a drowning person to a piece of driftwood. But deep down, a new, chilling suspicion was beginning to take root. It felt like a small, icy stone in the pit of her stomach. For the next 2 days, the silence was absolute. Her phone, once a source of comfort, now felt like a heavy, useless brick. She sent a few more texts, carefully worded to avoid sounding needy, but they went unread or at least unanswered. The silence wasn't just deafening, it was beginning to feel hostile. It was a silence that carried a message: I am not available to you. Finally, unable to bear the anxiety, Evelyn made a decision that felt both necessary and terrifying. She would drive to David's apartment. It was a 3-hour trip, but the thought of seeing him, of looking into his eyes and having a real conversation, was a powerful motivator. She had to know if he was okay. She had to see the truth for herself. The drive was a blur of anxious thoughts and desperate hope. She replayed their last conversations in her head, searching for clues, for anything she might have missed. Had she said something wrong? Had she been too demanding? She arrived at his building, a sleek, modern high-rise in the city's most expensive neighborhood. It was not the kind of place a struggling young entrepreneur would live. A fresh wave of unease washed over her. She took the elevator up to his floor, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She knocked on his door, a soft, hesitant rap. No answer. She knocked again, louder this time. A few moments later, the door opened, but it wasn't David. A young woman with a striking smile and a fashionable dress stood in the doorway. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice friendly but unfamiliar. "I'm Evelyn. I'm David's mother," Evelyn stammered, her mind scrambling to process the situation. The woman's smile faltered for a second, a brief flicker of surprise before it returned just a bit too bright. "Oh, hi, I'm Claire, David's girlfriend. He's not here right now. He's at a golf tournament." The words hit Evelyn like a physical blow. Girlfriend. Golf tournament? The promises of a struggling business, the late-night work sessions, they were all a lie. A cold, hard, unadorned lie. The icy stone in her stomach solidified into a rock. She looked past Claire and into the apartment. It was a masterpiece of modern luxury, filled with designer furniture she recognized from magazines, expensive art on the walls, and a view that stretched out over the city like a priceless painting. This was not the apartment of a man fighting to keep his business afloat. This was the apartment of a man living a life of utter extravagance. "The business? How is the business doing?" Evelyn asked, her voice barely a whisper. Claire laughed, a light, tinkling sound. "Oh, David doesn't have a business. He's between jobs right now, but he's been great. We've been having so much fun. He just bought a new car, a fantastic sports car, and we're planning a trip to the Bahamas next month." The words echoed in Evelyn's ears, each one a hammer blow to the fragile world she had constructed. The new car, the Bahamas trip, the expensive furniture, all of it was purchased with her money, her life savings, the legacy her husband had worked so hard to build. Her heart, which had been so full of love and trust, was now a hollow, echoing chamber. "I see," she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. She backed away from the door, a woman in a haze, her mind reeling. She didn't need to hear more. She had seen the truth, and it was far more monstrous than she had ever imagined. The son she had sacrificed everything for had not used her money for a business. He had simply taken it, and he had done so without a single moment of hesitation, without a shred of remorse. The love she had given him, so freely and so unconditionally, had been treated not as a precious gift but as a limitless resource. As she turned to leave, she felt a profound emptiness, a betrayal so deep it went to her very core. She had not only lost her money, she had lost her son. The David she had known, the kind and grateful boy who had promised to take care of her, had never truly existed. He was a ghost, a character in a story she had written for herself, and the truth had just erased him forever. She walked away from the beautiful building, her shoulders slumped, leaving behind the pieces of her shattered life. Evelyn drove home in a daze, the city lights blurring into streaks of color through her tear-filled eyes. The 3-hour journey back to her quiet house on Elm Street felt like an eternity. Every mile was a mile further from the son she thought she knew, and a mile closer to a reality she never wanted to face. She didn't cry in sorrow. She cried in a bitter mix of anger and humiliation. How could she have been so blind, so foolish? She, a woman who had managed a household and raised a child alone, had been played for a fool by the very person she had trusted most. She arrived home late at night, the silence of her empty house now feeling less like peace and more like a profound loneliness. She walked past the mantelpiece with the smiling photos of David, her reflection in the glass a stranger to her. The face was the same, but the eyes held a new, cold hardness she didn't recognize. She sat on her sofa, the one she had bought with a small portion of the savings, and the weight of her betrayal settled over her. The money wasn't the worst part. It was the realization that David's affection was a performance, a well-rehearsed act to get what he wanted. For the next few days, Evelyn stayed in her home, avoiding calls from friends and shutting out the world. She went through the motions of living, making coffee, tending to her roses, but her mind was a constant replay of her final conversation with Claire. The golf tournament, the new car, the Bahamas trip. Each detail was a fresh stab of betrayal. She had spent her life saving every penny, and David had spent it in a heartbeat on trivial luxuries. One morning, as she stood by her kitchen window, watching the sun rise over her neglected garden, something inside her shifted. The tears had run dry, and what was left was a fire, a quiet, burning rage. She was tired of being the victim, tired of feeling humiliated. She had given David everything she had to give, and he had taken it all without a second thought. But she had something he hadn't counted on, her resolve. She walked to her desk and pulled out a small black ledger, the one she had used for decades to meticulously track her savings. The entries for the last 3 months were all zeros, a stark, painful reminder of her foolishness. But as she looked at it, she saw not a record of loss, but a document of injustice. This wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a crime. Evelyn picked up the phone, her hands steady for the first time in days. She called her neighbor, Martha, a retired lawyer who had always been a kind and pragmatic friend. "Martha," she said, her voice a little shaky but firm, "I need to talk to you. I need your advice." Martha listened with a quiet, genuine sympathy as Evelyn recounted the entire story, the request for money, the broken promises, and the shocking truth she had discovered at David's apartment. When she finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Evelyn," Martha said slowly, "what he did is called elder financial abuse. It's a federal crime, and it happens more often than you think. You have a right to get your money back, and more importantly, you have a right to your dignity." Martha's words were a lifeline. They validated Evelyn's pain and gave it a name. It wasn't just a family dispute, it was a legal wrong. For the first time, Evelyn felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't fighting a son anymore, she was fighting for justice. "What do I do?" Evelyn asked, her voice filled with a newfound determination. "First, you get a good lawyer," Martha replied. "Not a friend of a friend, but a professional who specializes in these kinds of cases. You have documentation, bank statements, records of the transfer. It's a strong start. But most importantly, Evelyn, you have to be ready to fight. This won't be easy. He's your son, and he will use that against you." The thought of fighting her own son in court was terrifying, but the alternative, living a life in the wreckage of his betrayal, was even worse. She knew this was the only path to reclaiming her life. Evelyn hung up the phone, feeling a profound sense of purpose. The tears were gone. The fear had been replaced by a cold, quiet fury. She had spent her entire life nurturing and protecting her son. Now, it was time to protect herself. Her journey to reclaim her life savings and her dignity had just begun. The days that followed were a blur of cold, hard realities. Evelyn, guided by Martha, had her first meeting with a family law attorney named Robert Weber. Unlike her son's lawyer in the other story, Mr. Weber was an older man with kind eyes and a reputation for defending the vulnerable. Evelyn sat across from him in his office, the stack of bank statements and transfer documents on the table between them. Mr. Weber listened intently as she recounted the betrayal, his expression a mix of professional focus and genuine sympathy. "This is a clear-cut case of elder financial abuse, Mrs. Richter," he said, his voice calm and authoritative. "Your documents are airtight. We have a clear paper trail showing a pattern of financial transfers, and we have the motive, a complete and utter betrayal of trust. We can file a civil suit immediately to freeze his assets and begin the process of reclaiming your funds." As Mr. Weber spoke, Evelyn felt the first glimmer of hope she had known in weeks. This wasn't about love or forgiveness anymore. It was about right and wrong. It was about justice. The emotional pain of the betrayal was still there, a dull ache in her chest, but it was now overshadowed by a fierce resolve. She was no longer just a mother. She was a victim seeking restitution. The next morning, Mr. Weber's office filed the lawsuit. The legal papers were served to David's apartment, a cold, official delivery that marked the end of any pretense of a family relationship. Evelyn waited for his call, bracing herself for the manipulative apologies or the furious accusations she knew were coming. The call came that evening, but it wasn't what she expected. "Mom, what is this? Are you serious?" David's voice was filled not with remorse, but with a righteous indignation. He didn't sound like a son who had betrayed his mother. He sounded like a man who had been unjustly accused. "David, you know what it is," Evelyn said, her voice steady. "I want my money back." "Your money? It was a loan, Mom, a business investment. You agreed to it." He shouted, the rage in his voice raw and ugly. "How could you do this to me, to your own son?" His words were a masterclass in deflection. He made her the villain, the one who was being unreasonable and cruel. He accused her of trying to ruin his life, of being bitter and unsupportive. But Evelyn, armed with the cold facts of the law, no longer fell for his emotional manipulations. "You didn't invest it, David. You bought a new car and went on vacation," she stated, her voice devoid of emotion. "I saw it. I went to your apartment." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. The brief moment of shock was followed by a chilling laugh. "You're a crazy old woman, Mom. You went to my house. You're delusional. I'll fight this. You'll get nothing. And then you'll have to live the rest of your life alone." The threat of loneliness, a fear that had haunted her for a decade since her husband's death, was his most powerful weapon, but it had no effect. She was already alone. The difference was that now she was fighting to be alone on her own terms with her dignity intact. Evelyn hung up the phone. She sat in her living room, her heart beating a steady, determined rhythm. The first battle was over, and she hadn't given an inch. She knew that the real war was just beginning, and that her son, with his sharp tongue and twisted sense of entitlement, would be a ruthless adversary. But she was ready. She had her lawyer, her evidence, and a resolve forged in the fire of his betrayal. The calm before the storm was over. The storm had just begun. The lawsuit was filed, and the day of the first hearing arrived with a cold rain that mirrored the mood in the courtroom. Evelyn, dressed in a simple but dignified gray suit, sat next to her attorney, Mr. Weber. Across the aisle, David sat with his own lawyer, a slick man with a suit that looked far too expensive for a man between jobs. David's face was a mask of feigned innocence, a look Evelyn knew all too well. The proceeding began, and Mr. Weber started by methodically presenting the case. He laid out the timeline of events, from David's desperate phone call to the bank statements showing the transfer of Evelyn's life savings. He spoke of the trust a mother places in her son, a trust that had been exploited for financial gain. Then, David took the stand. Seeing him there, under oath, preparing to lie about her, was one of the most painful moments of Evelyn's life. This was the boy she had raised, the child she had protected from every hurt. Now he was standing in a court of law, ready to hurt her with a cold-blooded precision. David's testimony was a masterpiece of manipulation. He spoke with a practiced remorse, painting a picture of a devoted son who was a victim of a misunderstanding. "My mother has always been very generous," he said, his voice soft and trembling. "She believed in my business idea. The money was a gift, a way for her to invest in our future." He went on to describe Evelyn as a woman who was a little confused in her old age, prone to emotional swings and forgetting things. He even went so far as to imply that her decision to sue him was an irrational act brought on by her loneliness. "I think she's just sad," he said, his eyes welling up with what looked like genuine tears. "I love my mom. I would never take advantage of her. This is all a terrible mistake." Evelyn watched in silent horror. The lies were so convincing, so wrapped in a veneer of love and concern that she almost believed them herself. Then it was Mr. Weber's turn to cross-examine. He approached the stand, his demeanor quiet but his questions sharp and precise. "Mr. Richter," he began, "you testified that the money was an investment in a business. Can you tell the court the name of this business?" David hesitated. "It's a startup. It's not public yet." "I see, so there's no official business name, no LLC." Mr. Weber pressed. "No paperwork for a company that was, by your own admission, a few $100,000 short on its funding goal." David stammered, his facade cracking. "The paperwork is in process. It's all very new. Let's move on. You also testified that you have a close relationship with your mother. Can you tell the court when was the last time you called your mother for a reason other than needing money?" David's mind went blank. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. Mr. Weber didn't wait for an answer. "Is it true, Mr. Richter, that a few months after receiving the money, you purchased a new sports car and took a vacation to the Bahamas?" "Those were personal expenses," David said weakly. "Personal expenses or evidence of a life of luxury purchased with your mother's life savings." Mr. Weber's voice rose slightly. "Mr. Richter, my client visited your home. She saw the designer furniture. She spoke to your girlfriend. She knows the truth. You never intended to invest that money, did you? You intended to steal it." David's face turned a deep shade of red. He looked at Evelyn, and for a fleeting moment the mask of feigned innocence fell away. What she saw in his eyes was not regret, but a cold, burning hatred. It was the face of a stranger. In that moment, Evelyn knew with absolute certainty that the son she had loved was gone forever. He didn't answer. He couldn't. His lies had crumbled in the face of the truth. David's silence was a confession. The court had seen through his performance, and Evelyn felt a surge of validation. But the victory was hollow. As David's lawyer quickly intervened, requesting a recess, Evelyn's mind reeled. It wasn't the money that she was truly fighting for anymore, it was the son she thought she had. The man on the stand, with his desperate lies and bitter eyes, was a stranger. During the break, Evelyn sat alone in the hallway. She expected to feel triumphant, but a deep sadness settled over her instead. Her new friend Martha, the retired lawyer who had guided her this far, came and sat beside her, her presence a silent comfort. "You were incredible in there, Evelyn," Martha said, her voice soft. "You were so strong." "I don't feel strong," Evelyn replied, her gaze fixed on the floor. I saw him, the real him. The boy I raised, the man I was so proud of. He's gone, he doesn't exist. He's a lie." Martha put a gentle hand on her arm. "I know, the money is one thing, but the betrayal, that's the real theft. He stole your memories, your perception of him. That's a pain deeper than any financial loss." The words resonated with Evelyn. She had always believed that her love for David was a bond of steel, unbreakable and pure. But in the courtroom, she had seen it for what it truly was, a fragile illusion shattered by his greed. The money, she realized, was just the physical manifestation of that greed. The emotional damage was the true cost. Later, in a small conference room, David's lawyer approached them. He was slick and confident, a stark contrast to Mr. Weber's quiet professionalism. He offered a settlement. Mr. Richter is willing to return a portion of the funds to avoid a lengthy and public trial, he said, his tone suggesting this was an act of generosity. Evelyn's blood ran cold. He wanted to buy his way out of this. He thought her dignity had a price tag. And what about the rest? She asked, her voice firm. It's gone, the lawyer said with a dismissive shrug. Spent. You have to understand, these are the consequences of letting a young man live his life. The audacity of his words, the casual cruelty, infuriated Evelyn. They were treating her as if she were a nuisance, an obstacle to be paid off and forgotten. They still didn't see her as a person. They saw her as a problem. No, Evelyn said, her voice ringing with a new and unwavering conviction. I will not settle. We will go to trial. I want every single penny he took, and I want the world to know what he did. Mr. Weber looked at her with a flicker of surprise, then a slow smile of respect. Mrs. Richter's answer is clear, he told the opposing lawyer. The lawyer left, his air of confidence deflating into visible frustration. Evelyn knew her decision would drag this out, making it harder and more emotionally draining. It would be a full-scale war, but she was no longer fighting for money. She was fighting for a principle, for the thousands of other mothers who had been used and discarded. This was about justice, not just for herself, but for a silent army of victims. As she looked out the window, the rain had stopped. A sliver of pale sunlight was breaking through the clouds. It was a small sign, but it was enough. Evelyn knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but she was no longer afraid. She had lost her son, but in doing so, she had found her courage. And for the first time in months, she felt a glimmer of hope for a future that was truly her own. Evelyn's decision to refuse the settlement sent a ripple through the legal proceedings. David and his lawyer, confident that she would buckle under pressure, were visibly shaken by her resolve. Evelyn, on the other hand, felt a new sense of purpose. This wasn't just about winning a lawsuit, it was about exposing the truth and reclaiming her dignity. The pain of her son's betrayal was still a fresh wound, but now she was pouring salt in it, not to hurt herself, but to heal. Mr. Weber, impressed by her strength, began to build their case with renewed vigor. We need to show the court that you are not a confused old woman, as they've claimed, he told her. We need witnesses who can speak to your mental clarity and sound judgment. Evelyn was hesitant. Her world had become so small since Robert's passing. Her friends were few, her social circle limited to a few neighbors, and her weekly bridge club. She feared they would see her as a victim, a figure of pity. But Martha, ever the pragmatist, had a different view. Evelyn, these people know you, they've seen you, they know your character better than anyone. They've watched you live your life with grace and strength. The next day, Evelyn made a series of phone calls that were harder than she expected. She called her neighbor, Mr. Henderson, the bank manager who had processed the transfer. She called Mrs. Gable, the kind woman who ran her local garden center. She called her bridge club friends. To her surprise, their reactions were not of pity, but of shared outrage. Each one had a story of their own, a cousin, a friend, a neighbor who had been taken advantage of by family. Evelyn realized she was not alone. She was part of a silent fraternity of the betrayed. Mr. Henderson agreed to testify, providing a key piece of evidence, his own handwritten notes from the day of the transfer, in which he had expressed concern about the size of the withdrawal. He had discreetly noted Evelyn's firm, rational explanation that it was a business investment for her son, a detail that would now prove David's manipulative narrative to be a lie. I remember asking you if you were sure, Mr. Henderson said. And you were so certain. It was a transfer of trust, not just money. I'll tell the judge exactly that. Mrs. Gable from the garden center, a woman with dirt-stained hands and a heart of gold, was also a powerful witness. She testified about Evelyn's meticulous care for her garden, a passion that required planning, patience, and a sharp mind. Mrs. Richter knows the name of every plant, the right amount of sun and water they need, she told Mr. Weber. You can't be confused and have a garden like hers. Her mind is as sharp as a tack. The most powerful testimonies, however, came from Evelyn's Bridge Club friends. They spoke not only of her mental acuity and her ability to outsmart them in a game of cards, but also of her emotional state in the months leading up to the lawsuit. They had seen her pride when she spoke of David's supposed business, and they had seen her quiet sorrow when his calls stopped. They were a Greek chorus of her emotions, chronicling the full arc of her joy and her pain. They showed the court that Evelyn's actions were not a sudden, irrational break, but a rational and necessary response to a sustained and deliberate abuse. As the trial resumed, Mr. Weber presented these witnesses with a masterful touch. Their testimonies, simple and sincere, countered every one of David's polished lies. They were the voices of truth, of honest friendship, and of a community that had seen the manipulation firsthand. They turned Evelyn's quiet life into a powerful narrative of resilience and strength. When Mr. Weber asked Evelyn's friend, Susan, what she thought about David's claim of his mother being confused, Susan's response was a punch to the gut for the other side. Confused? The only confusion I saw was how she could have raised such a good boy only to have him turn into that. Her hand gestured vaguely towards David, who flinched. The courtroom erupted in a low murmur. David sat with a frozen, angry expression. He had expected to fight his mother and her lawyer, but he hadn't prepared to be confronted by her community, by the very people who had watched him grow up. He had seen them as invisible, as background characters in his story of success. But now, they were his accusers, their collective voice a powerful testament to his betrayal. The trial was no longer just a legal battle, it was a moral reckoning. The collective weight of Evelyn's witnesses was a devastating blow to David's defense. His lawyer, a man whose confidence had been built on a foundation of flimsy lies, looked increasingly flustered. The testimonies of Mr. Henderson, Mrs. Gable, and Evelyn's friends painted a portrait of a woman who was not only mentally sound, but who had acted with immense rationality and foresight. They had meticulously dismantled the confused old woman narrative and replaced it with a picture of a wise, albeit deeply hurt, woman. The final day of the trial was set for closing arguments. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension. David, who had spent the last few days looking like a trapped animal, now sat with his face pale and his hands clenched. He had lost control of the narrative, and his life savings were on the line. David's lawyer stood first. His voice, once smooth and persuasive, was now filled with a desperate edge. He tried to appeal to the emotional side of the court, speaking of the unfortunate breakdown of a family, and portraying Evelyn's lawsuit as an act of cold-hearted vengeance. "Your Honor," he said, gesturing dramatically toward Evelyn, "this is not about money. This is about a mother's refusal to accept her son's independence. It is a sad, petty attempt to control a grown man's life." He tried to discredit the witnesses, calling them biased friends who were merely caught up in Evelyn's emotional drama. Then Mr. Weber stood. He didn't speak with the same theatrical flair as the opposing counsel. His voice was calm, reasoned, and full of authority. "Your Honor, what we have heard today is not about a son's independence. It is about a son's greed," he began. He walked to the table and held up the bank statements. "We have provided irrefutable evidence of a financial transaction. The defense has provided nothing but accusations and vague promises. They have no business plan, no legal documents, and no evidence of an investment. What they do have is a new sports car, designer furniture, and a vacation to the Bahamas, all purchased with funds that were meant to provide for my client's retirement." He then spoke of the witnesses. "The defense would have you believe that Mrs. Richter's friends are merely biased. I would argue that their testimonies are the only true, unbiased accounts in this entire trial. They are not paid professionals. They are simply people who know my client, who have witnessed her kindness, her strength, and her heartbreak. Their testimony proves not that Mrs. Richter is confused, but that she is a woman who, after a lifetime of giving, finally chose to stand up for herself." He turned to face the judge, his voice clear and firm. "Justice, in this case, is not about punishing a son. It is about protecting a mother. It is about upholding the principle that trust cannot be a commodity to be bought and sold. Mrs. Richter's life savings were not an investment in a non-existent business. They were a deposit of a mother's love, and that love was stolen. We ask this court to rule in her favor and to compel Mr. David Richter to return every single penny he took." The judge, a serious woman with decades of experience, listened to both arguments without a change in expression. She then retired to her chambers to deliberate. The minutes stretched into an hour, then 2. The silence in the courtroom was a living thing, heavy with anticipation. Evelyn sat still, her hands clasped in her lap. She felt a profound sense of peace. No matter what the judge decided, she knew she had won. She had reclaimed her voice and her dignity. She was no longer a victim, she was a survivor. When the judge returned, her face was a neutral mask, revealing nothing. She cleared her throat and began to speak. "After careful review of all the evidence presented, including financial documents and witness testimonies, this court has reached a verdict. It is clear that Mr. David Richter, acting with full knowledge and intent, deceived his mother, Mrs. Evelyn Richter. His claims of a business investment were found to be without merit, and his actions constitute a clear and premeditated act of elder financial abuse. Therefore, this court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Mrs. Evelyn Richter, and orders the defendant, Mr. David Richter, to immediately return the full amount of funds taken in the sum of—" Evelyn's ears rang. The rest of the judge's words faded into a joyful hum. She had won. She had won it all. The victory wasn't just a legal one. It was a victory over her fear, over her pain, and over the betrayal that had nearly consumed her. She had proven that love cannot be bought, and that justice, when you fight for it, is a powerful force. The verdict was a lightning bolt of vindication. As the judge's words settled, a profound silence fell over the courtroom. David sat there, a portrait of defeat. The mask of entitlement had finally cracked, revealing the panicked, broken man underneath. Evelyn watched him, and for the first time she felt not anger, but a deep, quiet pity. He hadn't just lost the lawsuit, he had lost his dignity, his freedom, and any chance of reconciliation with her. His lawyer looked at him with a mixture of frustration and resignation. Outside the courthouse, the world felt reborn. The rain had stopped, and the sun broke through the clouds, painting the sky in hues of gold. Evelyn felt lighter, as if an enormous weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She had not only won back her money, she had won back her life. The money came back to her, every last penny. But she knew that simply putting it back in the bank wasn't enough. The money had been tainted by betrayal, and she needed to cleanse it to give it a new purpose. She started by taking back control of her life, piece by piece. She sold her house on Elm Street. It held too many memories, too many ghosts of the woman she used to be, the woman who had been so blind, so trusting, so willing to be a doormat. She moved into a small, sun-filled apartment in the city, a place with no history, a fresh start. She decided to honor her late husband, Robert, not by holding onto the money he left, but by giving it to a cause they both would have believed in. She donated a significant portion of her savings to an organization that fought against elder financial abuse, helping other women who were too afraid or too ashamed to stand up for themselves. The money was a symbol of her fight, and now it would be a weapon for others. With the remaining funds, she finally began to live. She enrolled in a painting class, something she had dreamed of for years but had always put off for one of David's emergencies. She took trips to places she had only seen in magazines, meeting new people and making new memories. Her life was no longer defined by the love she had to give, but by the love she found for herself. One evening, as she was painting a vibrant sunset from her new balcony, her phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. "Mom, please, we need to talk. I made a mistake." The message was from David. She read it, but she didn't feel the familiar pull of her old self, the need to rescue him. She had saved him so many times, but he had never saved her. She deleted the message without a reply. For the first time, she felt no guilt. She was finally living for herself, not for him. She had learned a fundamental truth. True love never comes with a price tag, and true freedom is never too expensive. Her name is Evelyn. She is 61 years old, and she has finally learned that the most important person to love and protect is yourself. Thank you all for listening to Evelyn's story. It's a testament to resilience, to the quiet strength that lives inside us all. I hope this story gives you the courage to stand up for yourself and to protect your peace. Please take care of yourselves and your loved ones. May your homes always be filled with happiness, and may your relationships be built on trust, not on money. With heartfelt wishes, Family Revenge Secrets.